Oh, okay.
The passage
Okay.
of Isaiah 6 is
I thought that was
attributed to
I thought that was a
Fadinel.
new view.
No, not at all. No. I wanted to start off by saying that I created a separate document to give Fadinel tips on grammar issues and typos and things like that. So I won't go into little typos. I'll just give that to him separately. But if there's a wording issue that I think could be addressed that isn't, that's bigger than that, a statement that I didn't understand because of word choices, then I'll address that. So the first thing that, let me do this. Usually I'm writing on the board, so I don't like to have the screen down. So you're not supposed to write on the screen. Dr. Marsh says that's been done.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
If we see you heading towards it with the marker, we'll
Yeah,
try
stop
to
you.
stop you.
Because it's a habit for the
It could
Hebrew,
be, yeah.
the Hebrew tutoring class, you know. Okay, so I wanted Fadinel to know that I liked his table of contents. It's helpful as a guide for the paper. And he has it broken down into his introduction, context, and then the vision, commission, conclusion, and bibliography. And I did have a suggestion based on what I saw later in the paper, which is on my next slide. And that is, he has number 1 labeled as the introduction, but he has 2 points under that, and then he jumps to point 3 for the vision. So in the table of contents, it looks like context should have those 2 points under it. Historical content and scriptural content should be here, because he's got the 1 and the 3, but not the 2. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Oops, went the wrong way. I liked his introduction and thesis statement. He gives an overview of the book in his introduction,
Right.
and then he explains what he thinks is happening in the book overall, and then he narrows in on Isaiah 6. And so I just cut and pasted his thesis statement here. However, the purpose of this paper is to exegete Isaiah 6 by considering first Isaiah's vision of the Lord's sovereignty and holiness, second Isaiah's vision of himself, finally Isaiah's commission to serve the Lord. So I like the thesis statement. It tells me exactly what he intends to do. I did have a few suggestions to make it better. I thought that if he included the verses that those divisions address, that would be helpful. And then he's listed the remnant as a point in his table of contents, but it's not in his thesis. So I'm assuming that's going to be a big point in his paper. He didn't get to that, but it seems like he should include that. So I reworked this, and just to give an example of how you might want to do it, putting the verses in and then putting a clause about the remnant into it. You might want to include all that. And then I also noticed in the introduction, he mentions that Isaiah 6 is pointing prophetically to the millennial kingdom, and that jumped out at me. I had not thought of Isaiah 6 that way before. So, and then I didn't see it addressed in the paper, and he may plan to address it because his paper's not finished. But in case, just because that was not something, I don't associate that easily off the top of my head with Isaiah 6. So I thought he might want to address that if he's going to leave that in his introduction.
Yeah, that would be a major point of discussion.
Mm-hmm.
Because most would, I mean, the thing that's debatable about this passage is, Fadinel, is whether or not it's his inaugural call or
Mhm.
not. And if it's his inaugural call, then what's it doing in chapter 6?
Mm-hmm.
This is what he's called
Right.
structurally. But if you're taking that to be the millennium, do we need to talk louder?
Just
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alex. And could it be both the millennium and the inaugural call? If this isn't his inaugural call, when was he called? Because it's pretty typical for the prophets to have that in there, right? I mean, so you have when they were called and what their commission was. So you can't just throw something out there. You have to sort through how it would affect, the interpretation of the whole book and the passage, and that will be a major issue.
So,
Good point.
yeah, if he doesn't want to address it or hasn't had time to go into all that,
Yeah.
then he could just take this statement out of his introduction. It jumped out at me, so.
Yeah, psychologically, you don't want to whet someone's appetite for
Right.
something.
I was looking for that later.
Yeah, because the Bible says hope deferred makes the heart sick. So the person's thinking, wow, we're gonna get this discussion of the millennial kingdom, then it's not there. It's kind of false advertising. But possibly because I know Fadinel wanted more time on the paper.
Yes, he wasn't finished.
Yeah, maybe he had.
So it
planned to
may
do
be that he intends to.
But if that's indeed his position, that would be important to explain.
I think one thing the paper does very well, the introduction does very well, is I think he's going to be making the argument that this interaction with the Messiah is the pivotal and foundational element of his entire ministry. It changes everything from this point forward.
Right.
And so his introduction focuses very strongly on the messianic content of it and how a face-to-face interaction with the Messiah changes his view. And it's a paper descriptive of the person he's introducing who's going to change his life. And I thought that was because I had not really thought of it as an introduction, like an introduction to the character, the way he puts it together of this person you're going to be meeting is the person that Isaiah met who changed his life as well. Yeah, like I understood it conceptually, but I thought the introduction was well done to bring out the messianic flavor of what he's seeing.
Right. That's a good point.
Since Fadinel's not here, should we do this a little bit like we did Fred's and stop at places to do this with each new section to get everybody's feedback?
Yeah,
Or
we
wait
can
till the end?
we can be free form.
Okay, good.
Yeah.
Okay, so are there any more comments or suggestions about the introduction or thesis statement?
So I thought that the introduction and the thesis of the paper was clear. It wasn't clear to me what he thought the thesis of the passage was.
Right.
Yeah.
And actually maybe that the thesis of the paper could be reworked so that it wasn't just a structural outline, but was more what the point was of the passage.
Good.
However, I did think that he divided the passage out well. So
Yeah.
Okay, for historical context, I thought that Fadinel did a nice job explaining the circumstances of Judah and Israel at the time of Isaiah's call. He goes into the political scene, the world scene, Assyria, and talks about the impact that had on Israel, and so I thought that was well done. And I thought he accurately portrayed the spiritual and political decline of the people. This is a really small point, but he lists the kings, and so I thought it would be good to include Manasseh as one of the kings. And he has cited Bayer, so I know he has that, and I had that too, so I just looked it up real quick and gave him a page for that if he wants to use that. And then he mentions that Assyria is the dominant power in the western region, and I thought it was the eastern region. So I looked at a map. I'm not great with that stuff, but do you want to comment on that? The western versus eastern?
I mean, in general, that whole region is the ancient Near East. And Assyria being east of Israel. Israel is typically, our point of reference in biblical studies. So Assyria, in relationship to Israel, is going to be northeast.
Okay.
Directly. So yeah, it would only be west, relative to Babylon or India or places like that. But unless he states that as his reference point, east would be the direction.
Does anybody else have any input about the historical context?
Well, like I said, we're assuming general conservative assumptions about Isaiah that create a framework from which we can get into meatier Hebrew topics that present themselves in a passage of Hebrew that we're exegeting. So where this becomes really interesting is, well, if this is his inaugural call, what does that tell us about that time, or how does what we know outside of Isaiah is going on at that time shed light on this passage? So, you really want to taper your discussion of these general issues around your given passage. And since this one, the watershed is it his inaugural call or not? If it is, then you look at 740 and the 740 window. You take a look at that. Did you get that illusion? Wasn't there the 740 window with the missions?
1040.
1040. Okay. I said it wrong. So, really looking around there, maybe specific language. So if you take the traditional view, he sees the Lord high and lifted up because Uzziah has just let him down, right? And his dreams are crushed because this guy died of leprosy because of his sin. So there's a vacuum. Uzziah reigned, how many years? Was it 52? Yeah, Manasseh reigned 55. So after that long period of time, you just have chaos because there have been such stability over 52 years. So you want to taper it, you want to contour it for your particular passage. And this passage, more than any other that the class wrote on, the historical context is really important because it's such a fulcrum time, I would say. Because think about it. It's 18 years before the northern kingdom goes into Assyrian captivity. It's 31 years before Sennacherib's invasion upon Judah. So it's really a pivotal time historically.
Anybody have anything to add to that? Okay, so in the scriptural context, thought he made a good point about the use of the first person. That is what changes the tone, the first 5 chapters being about all the sin and judgment and then hope too. But so when he talks about this, I thought, again, based on sorry, I'll answer that later. That distracted me. So he could expand on that based on the call issue that you're talking about. But it's obviously an interesting point. He goes to all of a sudden talking about himself and what he's seeing. He has a statement on page 3. This is one of those wording issues that I kind of know what he means, but he says Isaiah chapter 6 seems to be unique in its movement, and I thought you might want to describe that a little bit differently. I think this is what he's getting at, is that the first 5 chapters have been in third person and now he's shifting, but that's a little bit confusing at that to introduce the paragraph. The subdivisions,
Right, it's vague.
yeah, it's a little vague, and I caught it more as I kept reading. Oh, okay, I understand what that means, but I didn't understand it at the start.
Right.
The subdivisions are helpful, but he had given the 3 major divisions. And so when I got to the 5 subdivisions, my immediate thought was, I want to see the major divisions again to see what he's fitting the subdivisions into. So that would be helpful to put that in. Another just wording issue, but this could be taken to mean something totally different, is he says that there's a partial hope for some. Talking about the future hope, and I think what he just means is that there is hope for a remnant. I think that's what he means to say, but it sounds like the hope is what's partial, not a full hope. So again, I'm not going to address a lot of those wording issues unless they might affect the way the paper comes across. But I did
It'd be
address
good
those.
place to mention the remnant.
Right.
There's hope for the remnant.
Right, exactly. And, okay, so, let me see if I have another note, go into the vision. Does anybody else have any insights about the scriptural context that Fadinel gave?
Well, I would agree with your point that he makes an interesting observation when he tells you that there's been a significant shift in the narrative, and that now we're speaking third person instead of first person, which has preceded it for 5 chapters and will follow it for a few chapters. And I had not realized that myself, but I wonder if there's any way you could flesh out what that means for it. Like, what's the relevance of that, apart from just being an observation?
Right.
Especially in light of, because I really do think this is a picture of a life-changing moment for Isaiah. So it's interesting that he would take probably the most significant thing that's ever happened in his life and speak about it in the third person as if he was observing it.
Mm-hmm.
And so what does that tell us about how Isaiah views Isaiah 6?
Mm-hmm.
Well, no, it's the opposite. In chapter 6, he has switched to first person.
Yes, I'm sorry.
He's been third person for 1 through 5, and in 6, he's speaking in first person.
Right, I'm sorry. I'm mixing it up.
Okay.
Yeah.
But I mean, the 800-pound gorilla
His call.
in the room is, if this is his call,
Mhm.
why isn't it like,
Chapter
Jeremiah
1,
there in chapter 1? So
Right.
how do these first 5 chapters, set the table for
Right.
the turkey, which would be the inaugural call?
Mhm.
Using the
And this-
Thanksgiving dinner.
Right. The Thanksgiving dinner analogy.
That's right.
So this would be where he could begin to address that, with
Right.
the first person, or begin to flesh it out.
Because that's what I'm thinking, because,
Mhm. Why is it chapter 6?
yeah. And if it's the millennial kingdom, then when is his call? So
Mhm.
you got all these kind of issues. They're big issues. Yep.
2 more pages. Okay, Isaiah's vision. There's just a few typos here, and again, I'm giving Fadinel a whole other document on that, but just wanted to put it up for us to see. And then, for instance, in the year of King Uzziah died. Later, he says in the year of King Uzziah's death. So I know that's what he means to say here. This will take a few minutes to address. So the first paragraph about Isaiah's vision. Make sure. Okay, so this is the bottom of page 3. Fadinel talks about how the prophet begins with a monologue and unidentified first-person pronoun, I saw my Lord. And he elaborates a little bit on Isaiah using that to demonstrate his intimate relationship with the Lord by saying, my Lord. Now, on page 5, the first paragraph, Fadinel then says, although Isaiah doesn't use any personal pronoun that describes his relationship to the Lord, this chapter has the typological sense of Psalm 23. So there's a couple issues to address. So in his translation, he has Lord as if this is Yahweh. And here he's saying, so here's his translation, I saw the Lord. And then in this paragraph, he's explaining that Isaiah was saying, my Lord, but that's not how he's translated it here.
Right.
And then he mentions that this demonstrates the intimate relationship with the Lord. So I would suggest, of course, you're the expert, so you can clarify. This is my Lord's literally, but usually is translated the Lord, unless there's a reason to say my Lord. And it's definitely not Yahweh. It's Adonai. So I would suggest that he change the translation up here to lowercase. And if he wants to stick with the idea that this really is Isaiah saying my Lord, then change that. Or address this as a personal call if he decides to go with the Lord. Is that clear?
Yeah,
I know I've
and
jumped
so
around
the
a lot.
The assumption would be that the plural is the magisterial
Magisterial plural, right. So that was my assumption, so that's what I'm suggesting, that he just change it to the Lord. And then that impacts the other paragraph that I was discussing, because if he drops that, if he doesn't want to make this point about this being a personal relationship that Isaiah has and that that's why he's using this terminology, if he drops that, then this next statement on page 5 is fine, because he's saying here that Isaiah doesn't use personal pronouns that describe his relationship with the Lord, so he can leave that the way it is if he goes with the Lord for that earlier paragraph. Let's see. Does anybody have anything to add? Because I'm going to go through the vision somewhat closely. So.
Are we already through verse 4?
Do you mean verse 4 or page 4?
What verse are we through? Verse 1? In terms of discussion?
In terms of his paper, we're on paragraph 2. So paragraph 1 is at the bottom of page 3, going on to page 4. That's where he addresses this personal pronoun issue.
Right.
And then I jumped forward to page 5 just to finish that discussion, but we're back on page 4, paragraph 2.
Okay, page 4, paragraph.
Yes.
First full paragraph?
Just over
Yes.
verse 1.
Well, I think even within that paragraph, there's some interesting sentences which are kind of confusing, because he says that the book of Isaiah is saturated with first-person speeches, which Isaiah 6 would qualify as, and then he says later using the first-person singular is related to Yahweh speaking for himself. Others are in first-person plural, but Isaiah 6 is first-person singular, and it's definitely not the Lord speaking for himself. So
right.
there's
Well,
some
later he does, but
right, but not.
it's a little bit
Yeah.
confusing. Needs a little clarity. Anything to add there? The next paragraph, he's talking about the possible reasons why Isaiah mentions the death of King Uzziah. And my thought was what you were talking about earlier. He's been a relatively good king for a long time, and he's gone, and now there's this vacuum. And so there would have been this unsettled feeling to the nation. That's not one of the options that Fadinel goes into. So he talks about the prophet being upset, being lonely, those possibilities, and possibly being worried about divine judgment. But none of that was really clear to me from the context I would go with this.
Can I just ask a question? If this is Isaiah's call, wouldn't it just be natural that he would date that oracle, and wouldn't the convention just to be of mention the year King Uzziah died? So, like, my question is there like a spiritual and
Is there more to
theological significance to mentioning it, or is that simply the convention that he would have used to establish the date for this event of his life?
I studied Isaiah 6 really closely. It's been several years, but I spent like 6 months in this passage. And I thought it was both, because the king is on the throne in heaven versus the king who's died on earth. And this king died, he did well and died badly. Isn't that our worst nightmare? That we don't end well. And yet the king in heaven on the throne is sovereign and running the show. So I think that's there. I think it's both.
And in retrospect, knowing that the demise of the north in 722
Right.
at the hands of Assyria,
The context, the historical
yeah,
context.
that it really is a pivotal time in the nation's history, and who's in charge is going to be central in his concern, because he's going to be the prophet. So, yeah, I think it's both and.
Well, nonetheless, I mean, it's a reminder that God is sovereign over the events. The timing is not purely serendipitous.
Right.
No,
Right.
I think it's critical.
Right.
I think that's why it's all coming together. That's a SAT word. Any other?
We had a textbook called Serendipity. I still remember when I was in fifth grade, she explaining what it meant. Serendipity. Happiness. Elation. It wasn't serendipitous though, so you have to kind of extend beyond serendipity to make it the, that's.
Full.
Yeah.
The full meaning. Okay, any other comments on this